Hi everyone, welcome to Grace Kids. We're in our fifth lesson in our Babylonia and Beyond series, and last week we heard from Anna all about the unbreakable promise. This week I'm dressed as a shepherd. I wonder why. I've got my sheep too. Now I'm dressed as a shepherd because today's true story from the Bible, from the book of Ezekiel, is all about some very bad shepherds who didn't care for God's people. So I found my sheep. Here they are. Let's stand them up. And shepherds care for sheep. But sadly, in our story, the shepherds are very, very bad shepherds. And actually, Ezekiel, let's call this little man here Ezekiel. Ezekiel, one of God's prophets, is not talking about real sheep and real shepherds. So let's move my sheep and let's take off my shepherd's headdress. He's actually talking about God's people and about their leaders. And Ezekiel is telling God's people's leaders, the leaders of the people of Israel, that they are not good shepherds. They have not looked after God's sheep, the people of Israel, well at all. They are very bad shepherds. They are very bad leaders. Let's have a look at why. Now, there's lots of things that a good shepherd would do for his sheep. A good shepherd would take care of the flock. He would feed his sheep. He would help an injured sheep. He would find a lost sheep. He would be glad. He would be glad when he found his lost sheep, and he would protect his sheep from their enemies. And that is how God wanted the rulers of his people to be. He wanted them to protect his people, to look after them, to protect them from enemies, and to be with them. But sadly, they were bad leaders. God's people of Israel had bad leaders. They took care of themselves. They cared about their own food, not about finding food for the people. They didn't care about the sheep. They wouldn't find the lost sheep. And remember here, we're talking about God's people, not real sheep. They were angry and they treated the sheep badly. They didn't protect them from enemies. These were bad leaders, like bad shepherds, who didn't look after God's people. They were selfish. They cared about themselves first. Now, Ezekiel has a message for these bad leaders. God is going to be very angry with them. God will be against them. God will blame them for what's happened to his people. God will take away the sheep from these bad leaders. And remember, the sheep are his people. God will destroy these leaders. And God, this is the great news, God will replace these bad leaders with a good shepherd, that's a good leader, and he will be from the line of David. That means that he will be one of the relatives of the great King David. And actually, the great news in this story is that that person is going to be Jesus. Now, God hasn't forgotten about his people, the sheep. God says that he will rescue the sheep from the bad shepherds, and he himself will become the shepherd. He will search for the sheep and will gather them together in their own land. He will feed them. He will give them rest. He will bind the injured, will help the weak, will judge how the sheep treat one another. Because remember, God's people need to be looking after each other as well. And the great news is, he says he will become the shepherd himself. And we know that Jesus is the good shepherd who gave his life for the sheep. So, the great news in our true story from the Bible is that God saw the bad leaders who were not being good leaders to his people. God saw them, and God himself promises through the message of Ezekiel that he is going to come and be his people's true leader, a true good shepherd, the best shepherd. And he's going to send his son Jesus to be that good shepherd. And Jesus can be our good shepherd today. Jesus came to die on the cross so that we could follow him, so that we could trust him, and so that one day we can go to be with him in heaven. Jesus is the best shepherd, the best leader that we can ever have. Let's say a prayer. Dear God, thank you for sending Jesus to be the best shepherd. Thank you that you care for your sheep, for your people, so much that you sent the very best shepherd to be their leader and to be their king, to be our leader and our king if we are trusting in Jesus. Amen. Now, there's lots of activities and questions for you to do with your grown-ups. Have a really great week.